Welcome to 3 Minutes of History. I'm your future history teacher, Chris Oxenford, and let's get started.
July 11th, 1804, Weehawken, New Jersey. In the early morning hours, before dawn, two men are rowed across the Hudson River from New York City. They meet at the heights of Weehawken, an opening clearing beneath the Palisades Mountain, a popular site for duels of this kind. This encounter is more high-profile than most, because it pits the former Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, against the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. The tensions between the two men had been growing for years. Hamilton had endorsed Burr's political rival, Thomas Jefferson, during the intensely contested election of 1800, ensuring that Burr would be relegated to the unimportant post of Vice President. They had also clashed in an exchange of letters, in which Burr claimed that Hamilton had spread rumors and made statements that maligned his character. It was for this immediate cause that Burr had challenged Hamilton to a duel. By the time the two men were in position, the sun was coming up. The two men were directed by their seconds, the men actually running the duel, to move 10 paces apart and wait for the command "present" to turn around and fire at each other. Hamilton delayed the duel a moment by fumbling to put on his glasses. Once they were placed on his nose, Hamilton signaled his readiness to proceed. A moment later, the two men turned around and pulled the triggers on their pistols. Eyewitness accounts say that the two shots came very close together. Both eyewitnesses agreed, however, that Hamilton fired first and failed to hit Burr, and that Burr's bullet caused Hamilton to immediately fall to the ground, seriously injured. Burr tried to move toward his fallen enemy, apparently to see if he could assist him, but Burr was ushered away. Hamilton was carried across the river and would die the next day, surrounded by his wife and family. By all accounts, Aaron Burr was not particularly affected by shooting Hamilton. He had dinner that night at his home in New York with a visiting friend, and made no mention of the duel. After word of Hamilton's death was announced the next day, Burr was publicly condemned. Both New York, where the two men had lived, and New Jersey, where the duel had taken place, indicted Burr for murder. In a letter to his daughter Theodosia, Burr clipped, "New York and New Jersey are competing for the honor of hanging a vice president." His political allies arranged to have the murder charges against him dismissed, and in November he returned to Washington to preside over an impeachment trial. He finished serving out his term as vice president in March of 1805 and then left Washington. Burr made his way into the Midwest. He met 3 times with Anthony Barry, the British ambassador to the United States. Mary provided Burr with moral support and $1,500 to support his expedition, all without the approval of his superiors in London. Burr also met with Harmon Blennerhassett, who provided him with more financial support and access to an island in the Ohio River that he could use to train his troops and prepare for his expedition. Finally, Burr corresponded and met with General James Wilkinson, the governor of the Louisiana Territory. Wilkinson was a senior military leader in the United States, a friend of Burr's, and a spy for the Spanish government. Burr's scheme was to lead a military force down the Mississippi River to conquer Mexico, and also possibly the western portion of the United States, and to set himself up as the ruler of that territory, or possibly to march on Washington and overthrow Jefferson. The conspiracy unraveled in 1806. Wilkinson got cold feet and wrote a letter to Jefferson, outing the whole scheme. Burr managed to lead some troops down the Mississippi in December, but when he and Blennerhassett learned that there was a bounty for Burr's arrest, they surrendered to Mississippi authorities. A grand jury in Mississippi refused to indict Burr, and he escaped custody. He was, however, recaptured in February of 1807 and taken to Richmond, under guard, under charges of treason. Burr's trial was sensational and controversial. Thomas Jefferson was determined to see him convicted of treason. He provided George Hay, the leading prosecutor, with blanket pardons to be given to any of Burr's co-conspirators that might turn on him. And Jefferson arranged to have depositions taken at Blennerhassett Island, in Tennessee, and in New Orleans. Despite Jefferson's best effort, however, the case against Burr was weak. Under the U.S. Constitution, treason is defined as leveling war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to their enemies, and requires the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses. Burr's trial was presided over by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall. Marshall was an ardent Federalist and political opponent of Thomas Jefferson. Marshall ruled, in interpreting the requirements for a treason conviction, that it was not enough for Burr to have conspired to commit treason. He actually had to have waged war against the United States. Jefferson and the government tried to make its case by having Wilkinson testify against Burr. His testimony was sensational, but he could not produce the original letters that attested to Burr's plans, only copies written in his own hand that had been edited to remove Wilkinson's role. Other witnesses testified about preparations they had observed when raiding Blennerhassett Island, but none could definitely confirm that Burr had committed an overt act of treason. Thus, on September 1st, 1807, the jury, following Chief Justice Marshall's decisions, acquitted Burr of treason. Despite his acquittal, Burr left the United States in 1808. He lived in Europe until 1811, and then returned to New York under an assumed name. Burr's life in New York was relatively quiet until 1833, where he married a wealthy widow named Eliza Jumel. Eliza divorced him 4 months later, after she discovered that Burr was spending all of her money on land speculation. Burr suffered a stroke 2 years later in 1834 and died in 1836. Burr was laid to rest in Princeton Cemetery in New Jersey next to his father.